Some bonds are not written in contracts. They are not born from orders or rank or the cold language of duty. They grow in silence, in the space between a command and the moment a man decides to go further than he was asked. They grow in years spent standing in doorways while someone else sleeps, in the small choices made when no one is watching, in the strange and wordless understanding that forms between two people when one of them carries the weight of the other's life as though it were his own. This is one of those stories. It did not begin with a grand moment. It began with a boy who did not want to be watched and a man who had no choice but to watch him. Prince Rashid Al Farouk was 7 years old the first time he tried to escape his own palace. He had planned it with the thoroughness of someone 4 times his age. He had studied the shift rotations of the household guards, memorized which corridor cameras had the blind spot near the east courtyard fountain, and stolen a plain white thobe from the laundry room so he would not be recognized. He had even mapped, on the back of a school worksheet, 3 possible routes to the old market district where he had once glimpsed from a moving motorcade, a man selling fried dough on a cart. The dough had looked golden and improbable and nothing like the things served on silver trays in his dining room. He made it 17 minutes before someone found him crouched behind an ornamental hedge near the garden wall, shoes already dirty, worksheet map clutched in one hand. That someone was not a senior officer. It was not his father's chief of security or one of the ceremonial guards posted at the palace gate. It was a junior member of the Royal Protection Detail, 26 years old, newly assigned to the household. A man named Tariq Mansour who had grown up in a mid-sized city 400 kilometers from the capital and who had at that moment been on his first solo night shift. Tariq did not raise an alarm. He did not radio his supervisor. He crouched down to the hedge level, looked at the boy, and said in a voice completely without drama, "The east wall camera actually doesn't have a blind spot. They fixed it last month." Rashid stared at him. "Your map is also wrong," Tariq added. "The market is southeast, not east." There was a long pause. Rashid looked down at his worksheet. "How do you know where I was going?" "You've asked your tutor 3 times this month about street food markets." "I pay attention." Rashid had been around palace staff his entire life. He understood the particular flatness of professional deference, the way people looked at him without quite seeing him, the practiced smile, the slightly too formal language. Tar did not speak like that. He spoke like a man who found the situation mildly interesting and was not especially worried about saying so. "Are you going to tell my father?" Rashid asked. Tariq appeared to consider this seriously. "That depends," he said. "Are you going to try again tomorrow?" Rashid thought about lying. He decided, for reasons he could not have explained, not to. "Probably." Tariq nodded, as though this were a reasonable answer to a reasonable question. "Then, we have a problem to solve together." He walked Rashid back inside. He did not hold his hand or guide him by the shoulder the way adults usually did, as though children were objects that needed to be steered. He simply walked beside him through the corridor, past the east courtyard fountain, and back to the residential wing. At the door he said good night and returned to his post. He did not report the incident. In the morning, Rashid found a folded piece of paper slipped under his bedroom door. It was a hand-drawn map, more detailed than his own. It showed the palace grounds, the surrounding streets, the location of the market, and, marked with a small star, the specific cart that sold fried dough. In the margin, in neat, economical handwriting, were the words, "Next time, ask me first." Rashid kept that map for 11 years. The palace was not a simple place to grow up. People have a version of royal childhood in their heads that is assembled from movies and fairy tales. The gold, the ease, the endless rooms, the sense of floating above ordinary life. What they do not picture is the particular loneliness of it. The way every adult in a room calibrates their behavior the moment you enter. The way friendship always carries the faint taste of proximity to power, so that you can never be entirely sure which thing people are drawn to. The way you are taught from early age that your body, your movements, your choices, your errors are not entirely your own, that they belong in some structural sense to a family, a lineage, a country. Rashid understood this early. He was not a difficult child. He was a thinking child which is sometimes harder to manage. He asked questions that made his tutors consult with each other before answering. He sat through state dinners with the expression of someone doing complex arithmetic. He had his father's cheekbones and his mother's habit of going very still when he was trying to understand something, and neither parent had any idea what to do with a child who watched the world as though it were a problem he was quietly working out. Tarek had been reassigned twice in the 2 years following that first night. The palace security structure moved personnel regularly to prevent attachment, to maintain what the senior officers called operational distance. It was policy. It was sensible policy. It did not work. Every time Tarek was rotated back into the household detail, Rashid noticed. Not obviously. He had learned, even by age 9, the value of not making his feelings visible to the adults around him. But Tarek noticed that Rashid noticed. And Tarek, in the careful and oblique way that would come to define their dynamic for the next 2 decades, acknowledged it just enough. A nod. A map left under a door. A book about architecture left on the window seat of the corridor outside the library where Rashid spent his Wednesday afternoons, with no name on it, but with certain pages dog-eared in the way that said, "I thought you'd find this part interesting." Rashid always found those parts interesting. By the time Rashid was 12, Tarek had been formally assigned as one of 3 primary guards on the Heir's personal detail. By the time Rashid was 15, there were 2 primary guards. By the time he was 18, his security team was restructured again, and Tarek, now 37, with the calm, unhurried manner of a man who had spent a decade learning the specific shape of one person's world, was named as lead. It was not, officially, because of their relationship. It was because Tarek was exceptionally good at his job. His record was clean. His instincts were considered by every evaluation metric the Palace Security Division used to be in the top tier of the entire Royal Protection Service. He was the kind of man who solved problems before they became problems, who thought in contingencies without becoming paranoid about them, who could be in a room full of tension and remain the least reactive person present. He had also, over 11 years, learned Rashid the way cartographers learn coastlines. He knew which silences meant thinking and which meant trouble. He knew that Rashid ate nothing before a public appearance that he was anxious about, and so would quietly arrange for food to be available after. He knew that Rashid disliked being touched on the shoulder, but did not mind a hand on the arm, and had corrected 3 other staff members on this distinction without being asked. He knew that the thing that looked like impassivity on Rashid's face during official functions was actually a very specific kind of exhausted alertness, and that the thing that looked like irritation was usually grief in a different coat. Rashid knew things about Tarek too. He knew that Tarek had a younger sister in the city who he called every Sunday morning, and that the calls were usually short and usually ended with him looking at the middle distance for a few minutes after he hung up. He knew that Tarek read history the way other people read thrillers, consuming it fast, and then going back to certain pages repeatedly. He knew that Tarek had declined a promotion 3 times, each time citing preference for field work, and that this preference had nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with not wanting to be behind a desk while Rashid was somewhere uncontrolled. Neither of them named any of this. It lived in the gap between what was said and what was meant in the small adjustments they made for each other without explanation, in a way a room shifted when both of them were in it. The first real test came when Rashid was 19. He was in his 2nd year at a university in the capital. A concession his father had made to Rashid's insistence that he not be educated entirely in isolation from people his own age. The security arrangements were elaborate and mostly invisible, which was the point. Rashid walked to lectures in the morning with 2 guards in plain clothes at appropriate distance, lived in a residential hall with modified security protocols that the other students mostly did not notice, and was allowed, within limits, to exist as something approaching a normal person. He was not, of course, a normal person, but the performance of normalcy had its own value, and Rashid had gotten good at it. What he had not gotten good at was what to do when someone from his cohort invited him, on a Tuesday evening in October, to a gathering at a house 30 minutes off campus. He went. He did not tell Tarek the location in advance. He told himself this was because he did not want the gathering disrupted by the visible presence of security, which was partially true. The other part, the part he did not look at directly, was something closer to the desire to be, for one night, a person with no perimeter around him. He was there for 40 minutes before Tarek appeared in the doorway. Not dramatically, not with radio in hand or hand near holster. He appeared the way water appears in a low place, because that was simply where the situation had directed him. He scanned the room with the quick information processing attention that Rashid had watched him use 1,000 times, located Rashid at the back corner, and settled himself near the entrance with a glass of water and the expression of a man who had nowhere better to be. Rashid crossed the room. I didn't give you this address. No, Tarek agreed. How did you? Your friend sent a location pin in the group chat. A pause. You were added to the group chat last week. I have access to your messages for security purposes. You know this. Rashid didn't know this. He was irritated anyway, which was not fair, and he knew that too. I'm Feenet. I can see that. You don't need to be here. Tarek looked at him. Not the professional scan, the other one, the one that Rashid had felt since he was 7 years old. The one that said, I'm paying attention to the actual thing you mean, not the thing you said. I know. Tarek said, I'm here anyway. Rashid went back to his corner. He stayed another hour. When he left, Tarek walked 3 steps behind him, not beside him, which was the professional distance, the correct distance, the distance that said guard in, not something else, but at the car in the cold and the quiet. Tarek said, next time, tell me where you're going. It was not an order. It was not quite a request. It was the same thing he had said, in different words, 11 years ago at a palace hedge, to a boy with a wrong map and a craving for fried dough. Rashid got in the car without answering. He told him next time. He always told him after that. There is a thing that happens between two people who have spent years in close proximity. Not intimacy in the conventional sense, not friendship exactly, but something that lives in the infrastructure of daily life. The way one person begins to anticipate the other's movements. The way silence becomes a language. The way a glance across a room carries more information than most people's conversations. It builds slowly without anyone deciding it should. And one day you look up and realize the architecture of your life has been quietly shaped around someone else's presence. And you do not know what the building looks like without that particular load-bearing wall. Rashid was 23 when he started to understand what he had, and 24 when he began to understand what it cost. The state visit to Geneva was the first major international engagement Rashid handled as a formal representative of his country's foreign policy interests. His father was not well. The health situation was managed carefully and disclosed even more carefully, but within the family it was understood that the handover was no longer hypothetical. It was a horizon. Rashid had begun sitting in on meetings he had previously only heard about secondhand. His schedule had changed shape. The weight of what was coming had settled onto him the way weather settles, not all at once, but in a steady, relentless accumulation. He handled it the way he handled most things, by not talking about it, by going very still on the inside while continuing to function on the outside, by channeling the pressure into work. The Geneva delegation was 17 people. The security detail traveling with Rashid was 8. Tarek had coordinated the advanced security sweep himself, liaising with the Swiss Federal Security Service for 3 weeks before departure, rebuilding the hotel floor plan twice after the event schedule changed, running contingency scenarios until they stopped producing surprises. On the flight over, Rashid worked through a briefing document of 240 pages. Tarek sat 2 rows back in the configuration that gave him maximum sight line to both exits and to Rashid. At some point past midnight, when most of the delegation was asleep, Rashid looked up from page 187 and found Tarek awake, reading. History, Rashid asked. Tarek held up the book. Byzantine military organization. 8th century. I have questions about the delegation from the Energy Ministry, Rashid said. Not about Byzantium. I know. The minister's position on the water treaty amendments doesn't align with what I was briefed. He said something in the pre-meeting that suggested he has a separate mandate. Tarek was quiet for a moment. This was the part that people outside their dynamic always found strange. The fact that Rashid talked to him about this. Not his policy advisors, not his chief of staff, not the senior members of the delegation who had decades of diplomatic experience. He talked to Tariq. It was not because Tariq was a political expert. He was not. It was because Tariq was the one person in any room who had no investment in what Rashid decided. Everyone else needed something from him. Alignment, approval, a direction they could use. Tariq needed nothing except that Rashid not get shot. And the scope of that mandate was so specific and so different from everything else that it had over the years, made him the clearest mirror available. What did he say exactly? Tariq asked. Rashid told him. Tariq listened in the way he always listened, without interrupting, without his expression changing, absorbing. He's protecting someone in the ministry, Tariq said. Someone who loses if the amendments pass. He'll push for delay, not rejection, so it doesn't look like opposition. Rashid looked at him. You got that from one sentence. It's the same thing people do when they're covering for someone they can't openly protect. The hesitation is always in the same place. Rashid went back to his document. You should have been a diplomat. I don't have the shoes for it. Rashid almost smiled. Almost. The Geneva meetings went well by every public metric. Rashid was described in 3 separate coverage pieces as composed beyond his years and a statesman in formation. His father's communications team circulated the coverage. There were internal congratulations. The delegation returned home with 2 memoranda of understanding and a framework agreement that would take another 18 months to materialize into anything. But the framework was real, and the relationships established around it were real. What no coverage mentioned, because no coverage knew, was what happened on the second evening. There had been a dinner. Long. The kind designed not to produce outcomes, but to produce relationships, which requires a different and more exhausting kind of performance. Rashid had sat through 4 hours of it with a diplomatic composure that had apparently made such an impression on the press. And when it was over, he had gone back to his floor of the hotel and stood at the window for a long time looking at the city's lights on the water. Tariq appeared at the door, as he did at the end of each day's operations, to run through the next morning's schedule and confirm the security protocol for the first meeting. Rashid said, without turning from the window, "My father has maybe 2 years." Tariq was quiet. The doctors gave him a range. 2 years is the top of it. The actual number is probably less. He paused. No one is supposed to know I know that. I'm not supposed to know that. I found it in a document I was not supposed to access. More quiet. Then, what did you do with the document? Put it back where I found it. Pretended I hadn't seen it. Good. Rashid turned. That's your response? Good. Tariq's face carried something that was not sympathy exactly. Too precise for sympathy, too specific. It was the look of someone who understood the exact shape of the thing you were carrying and was not going to insult it by pretending it was smaller than it was. You're asking me what to do with it, Tariq said. I'm not asking you anything. I'm telling you because there is no one else in this building I can tell. The sentence landed. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Tariq crossed the room, not to Rashid, but to the chair near the window and sat down in it. Not the guard's position, not the standing at post position, but the position of a man who was going to stay a while. Tell me, he said. So Rashid told him, not just the document, the whole architecture of fear that had been building for months. The weight of the coming transition, the specific loneliness of being prepared for something by people who could not fully acknowledge what it was. The feeling of being handed a country like a stone. Tariq listened for 2 hours. He asked questions twice. He offered no reassurance, which was the right instinct. Reassurance would have been noise. What he offered was attention, the full and unpartitioned kind, the kind that makes a person feel that what they're saying is worth the air it takes to say it. At some point past 2 in the morning, Rashid stopped talking. You should sleep, Tariq said. I know. I'll be outside. I know that too. Tariq stood, moved to the door. Rashid said, to the window, to the lights on the water, I don't know how to do this without, he stopped. Tariq waited. Rashid did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The years between Rashid's 24th birthday and his 27th were years of transformation. Not dramatic, not sudden, but the slow and irreversible kind that happens when a person is required by circumstance to become a larger version of themselves than they initially thought possible. His father's health declined along the predicted timeline, and then faster. The handover of formal responsibilities began earlier than planned. Rashid took on the role with the same quality he had brought to everything since that first escape attempt. Thorough, quiet, slightly exhausting in its completeness. Tariq's role evolved alongside him. The security team expanded. The protocols became more complex. The threats, previously theoretical, became occasionally concrete. Not dramatic film-grade attempts, but the steady background noise of geopolitics meeting a person who now made decisions that had consequences. There were 2 incidents in those years that required Tariq to make split-second choices that he had spent a decade mentally rehearsing. Both times, Rashid was fine. Both times, after the protocols were completed and the reports were filed and the security debrief was done, Tariq was the last one in the room. And both times, when everyone else had gone, he sat with the particular stillness of a man who has just fully processed what almost happened. Rashid noticed. He always noticed. He did not say anything the first time. The second time, he said, "You're allowed to find that hard." Tariq looked at him. "I know. You don't act like it. I act like what the job requires." "The job," Rashid said, "has never required you to be made of something different than what you are." It was perhaps the most direct thing Rashid had ever said to him. Tariq received it the way he received most things, without flinching, without deflecting, with a stillness that was not avoidance, but something more like absorption. "Get some sleep," Rashid said. Tariq got some sleep. In the morning, he was back at his post, which was not a post anymore in any meaningful sense. It was just where he stood, in a way that certain things stop being roles and become simply the shape of a life. The wedding announcement came in the spring of Rashid's 27th year. It had been in development for longer than most people knew. The political dimensions of a royal marriage are never uncomplicated, and the specific dimensions of this one had required 18 months of careful navigation. The woman was appropriate in every formal sense, and, more importantly, was someone Rashid actually liked, sharp, unsentimental, with a dry humor that reminded him slightly of himself. He told Tariq about it on a Thursday morning, in the car on the way to a meeting, which was not a significant choice in the moment, but which would come to feel like one later. "Her name is Nadia," he said. Tariq, in the front seat, did not turn around. "I know. I've read her security file." "Of course you have. She's smart." "Yes. She'll probably try to figure out your security arrangements in the first month. She'll want to know where all the moving parts are." Rashid looked out the window. "I know." A pause. "You'll need to tell her about me. About how this works." It was an unusual thing to say. Not the content. The briefing of a new member of the royal household on security arrangements was standard, but the particular phrasing. "How this works. I know," Rashid said again. The car moved through the city. The morning was ordinary and bright. Outside the window, people moved between their lives with the freedom of anonymity, going to places where no one was keeping track of whether they returned. "She'll understand," Tariq said. Rashid turned to look at the back of his head, the familiar set of his shoulders, the precise way he held himself even in a moving car, the presence that had been the fixed point of his geography for 20 years. "How do you know?" Rashid asked. Tariq was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because she loves you. And anyone who loves you will understand that some things in your life were put there before she arrived. And they're load-bearing. You don't remove them." The car stopped at a light. The city moved around them. Rashid said nothing. He had said nothing in that car on a Thursday morning in spring, but what he had heard would stay with him for the rest of his life. Not the words exactly, but the understanding beneath them. That what existed between them had been named, in its oblique and careful way. That Tariq understood what he was in the structure of Rashid's world. That he had known for a long time, and that he had stayed anyway, not because he had to, not because duty required it beyond the point his contract specified, but because some things do not need to be justified. Because a man who walked beside you for 20 years has made a choice, again and again and again that is not about rank or assignment or obligation. It is about something older than all of those things. Something that does not have a clean word in any language. Something that looks from a distance like duty and is from closer up much more than that. The last thing most people understand about loyalty is that it ages. It does not stay the same thing it was when it was new. When loyalty is young, it is clean and simple. You're where you're supposed to be. You do what you're supposed to do. The coordinates are fixed and the map is readable. But loyalty that survives for 25 years through a human being's transformation from a child to a king has been tested by time in ways that simple fidelity never encounters. It has had to survive the moments when everything changes, when the person you serve is no longer who they were, when you're no longer who you were, when the distance between you has shifted in ways that cannot be put in a file or reflected in a title. The loyalty that survives all that is not duty anymore is something you build with your hands in the dark, year by year, choosing it each time, even when you could have chosen differently. Rashid's father died on a Tuesday in November, 6 days after his 58th birthday, in the early hours of the morning when the palace was at its most quiet. Rashid had been at his bedside for the previous 4 days. Tariq had been outside the door for those same 4 days, with short breaks that his deputy covered, returning each time without being asked. No one told him to stay. The situation had moved beyond the specific language of security. The man inside the room was not in any danger that a guard could protect against. But Tariq stayed nonetheless because the line between protecting a person's body and protecting their capacity to endure is not always visible. And he had learned long ago that his job was the full thing, not just the part that could be written into a contract. When the doctors came out and the family was notified and the household protocols were activated and the first of the formal notifications began to move through the channels that would eventually announce to the world that a king had died and another had begun, Tariq was still outside the door. And when an hour later, Rashid stepped into the corridor alone, coat slightly wrong on his shoulders, eyes carrying the particular look of a person who has just watched the last barrier between themselves and an enormous thing dissolve, Tariq was there. He did not say anything. He did not offer condolences in the formal register, the careful language that everyone else would spend the next week offering. He simply looked at Rashid with the full attention that had been the constant of their relationship since a 7-year-old tried to escape a palace with a wrong map. Rashid looked back at him. Then he said quietly, "I need an hour. Just an hour where nothing is asked of me." "Yes," Tariq said. "I want to walk. I know a route." They went down through the residential wing, out through the east courtyard, past the fountain that had been there since the night all of this began, through a garden corridor that led out onto a section of grounds that was technically within the security perimeter, but felt in the dark of a November morning like the edge of something open. They walked for 53 minutes. Rashid did not speak. Tar did not speak. They moved through the cold and the dark and the almost absolute silence of a place that did not yet know it was the residence of a new king, because the morning was still new and the world had not been told. When they came back inside, Rashid stopped at the entrance to the corridor that led back to the family wing. "Thank you," he said. It was 2 words, insufficient for 25 years. Rashid knew this and said them anyway because they were the only ones he had. Tariq nodded once. Then he stepped back to his post, which was now the post of the Chief of Royal Security, a title formalized 6 months later, though the substance of it had been true for years. He did not make it into something it wasn't. He simply stood there, in the way he had always stood, the same man he had been in the East Courtyard at midnight, when this was still just a boy and a guard and a wrong map on a worksheet. The first year of Rashid's reign was not a year he would describe as good. It was a year he survived, which is its own kind of achievement. The handover had been prepared for. The institutional knowledge had been transferred. The advisors were experienced. The frameworks were in place. None of this meant that the experience of becoming at 29, the person in whom all the weight of a nation concentrated, of waking up each morning and being that, was something that frameworks could fully absorb. He made decisions that kept him up at night. He made decisions that he knew were right, and that cost him anyway. He sat through meetings where everyone in the room was waiting for him to say the thing that would unlock the room's direction, and he said it and then went back to his office and sat with the particular solitude of the person who has to carry the consequence of what they decided. Through all of it, Tarek was there. Not always in the room, not always visible, but there in the perimeter, in the infrastructure, in the way that the environment around Rashid was quietly managed to reduce the friction of an already friction-full life. The small things accumulated. A car that was always warm in winter before Rashid got in it, though Rashid had never mentioned the cold. A particular brand of tea that appeared in his office the week before a difficult summit, though Rashid had only had it once, 3 years earlier, at a state function in Istanbul. A security briefing restructured to be 15 minutes shorter because Tarek had noticed that the old format ended at exactly the point where Rashid needed to shift his cognitive attention to the next thing, and the overlap was costing him. Rashid noticed all of it. He said almost nothing. This was also a form of communication. Nadia, who had understood from the beginning in the way Tarek had predicted she would, developed her own relationship with him over the first years of the marriage. Not close in the way she was close with her own family, not informal in the way she was informal with friends, but something functional and gradually warm. She was sharp enough to recognize what she was looking at and unsentimental enough not to be threatened by it. One evening in the second year, she said to Rashid, after a dinner where Tarek had been present for the early part and then quietly withdrawn when it was no longer necessary, "He loves you." Rashid was quiet. "Not," she said, searching for precision. "Not romantically, but the other kind. The kind that doesn't have a name because it doesn't fit any of the categories we have for it." "I know," Rashid said. "Do you love him?" Rashid thought about this for a long time. He thought about a 7-year-old and a hedge and a wrong map. About a book left on a window seat with pages dog-eared. About a car on a Thursday morning and load-bearing. About the East Courtyard in November in the dark and the cold, and 53 minutes of silence that held more than most conversations ever managed. "Yes," he said. "Have you told him?" "In every way, I know how that isn't those words." She nodded. She understood because she knew both of them now. "He knows," she said. The incident that the security file would later classify as a Category 1 threat occurred in Rashid's 4th year as king, during a trade summit attended by 6 heads of state. The threat was disrupted before it became anything the public heard about. The details are not the point of this story. What is the point? What matters is the 12 seconds in which Tarek placed himself between Rashid and the direction of an unsecure variable, and then the moment after in the corridor when the threat was neutralized and the room was secured and the detail was standing down. Tarek's hands were steady. They were always steady. His face carried the same neutrality it carried in board meetings and car rides and late-night conversations about Byzantine military history. But his jaw was tight in a specific way that Rashid had only seen twice before. Rashid looked at him. Tarek looked back. "I'm fine," Rashid said. "I see that." Rashid stopped. Tarek's jaw released slightly. He exhaled once, controlled, the way a person exhales when they've been holding something they did not realize they were holding. "I know," he said, before Rashid could finish. He always knew. There are relationships that history records and relationships that history does not, and the ones that are not recorded are not always the less significant ones. The unrecorded ones are often the ones that actually held things together. The people who were there before and after the official moments, in the margins of the photographs, in the rooms the cameras didn't enter, in the years between the events that get marked on timelines. Tarek Mansour served as chief of royal security for 19 years. He retired in his 54th year on a Thursday, which was not a meaningful coincidence, but Rashid noted it anyway, because he had the habit of noting the specific weight of ordinary things. The retirement ceremony was official and appropriate. There were words spoken. There was a decoration awarded. There was applause in a room full of people who understood they were watching the end of something that had lasted more than 3 decades. Rashid gave the formal remarks. They were good remarks, precise and warm and careful in the way that public language about private things always has to be careful, navigating between what is true and what could be said. Afterward, when the room had cleared, when the staff had moved on to the next thing, and the decoration was boxed, and the official portion of the afternoon was complete, Rashid walked across the empty room to where Tariq was standing. He had something in his hand. Tariq looked at it. It was a piece of paper, folded, worn at the creases. It had been folded and unfolded many times over 32 years. The lines on it were in the handwriting of a 26-year-old man who had crouched behind a hedge to talk to a boy with a wrong map, and they showed the layout of a palace, and the streets beyond it, and a specific cart in a specific market, marked with a small star. In the margin, in that same handwriting, "Next time, ask me first." Tariq looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Rashid, and something moved through his face. Not tears, nothing so simple, but the full weight of 32 years arriving in a single moment, the entire accumulation of who they had been to each other pressing into the space between them, the thing that had never needed to be named because it had always been larger than any name they could have given it. "You kept it," Tariq said. "Of course I kept it," Rashid said. He held it out. Tariq took it. He held it the way you hold something that is both very light and very heavy, both a piece of paper and the entire record of a life. "There's something on the back," Rashid said. Tariq turned it over. On the back, in more recent handwriting, Rashid's handwriting, were 3 sentences. "You taught me that the map matters less than who makes it with you. Asterisk 32 years. Asterisk thank you." Asterisk Tariq read it twice. He looked up. There was nothing to say that was adequate. There never had been, which was why they had spent 32 years finding other ways to say it. In maps, in books left on windowsills, in walking through the cold, in standing outside doors when no one asked you to, in being reliably and without exception the one fixed point in a life that was required by its nature to be always in motion. "You should have been king," Tariq said. "You were always going to be fine." Rashid shook his head. Not without the map. The room was empty and quiet around them, the kind of quiet that only settles in places where something important is just finished. Outside the windows, the city moved in its ordinary way, full of ordinary lives that did not know this room existed or what had just passed in it. 2 men stood in it. One had spent 32 years protecting the other. The other had spent 32 years, in every way available to him, trying to deserve it. Neither of them moved. The afternoon light came through the windows and lay across the floor. And for a moment, just a moment, they were not a king and his guard, not the heir and the man assigned to protect him, not any of the formal categories their relationship had been filed under in 32 years of official documents. They were just 2 people who had chosen each other in a way that matters, which is not once, but every day, and not because they had to, but because some things in a life are load-bearing, and you do not remove them. You never remove them. In the archives of the royal household, in a file that is not classified but is also not widely read, there is a security incident report from a Tuesday night in October, 30 years before the end of this story. It describes a 7-year-old child located behind a hedge near the east courtyard, in possession of an incorrect map, apparently attempting to access a street food market in the city's southeastern district. The report notes that the child was returned to the residential wing without incident. In the space marked corrective action taken, in handwriting that belongs to a 26-year-old officer on his first solo night shift, someone has written 4 words. None required. Map provided, asterisk.